Okay, I'm ready for my close-up. Oh, we're live? Or just kidding? I did that on purpose. So I'm thrilled to be doing this. Alexia Latortue is my friend. Alexia Latortue is a patriot. Alexia Latortue is a really effective public servant. We're really lucky to have her as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for, is it International Affairs or
No, Trade and Development.
For Trade and Development. It's a really big job at the Treasury Department. She oversees our relations with the MDBs and has served at the Treasury Department before. She served at the EBRD. She's really smart and she's really effective. So I could go through her bio. You can read her bio. But I like her personally, and everybody in town likes her and thinks she's nice and smart and effective and don't want to mess with her. So there's all true. That's all true. So I'm really happy to be having this conversation. I'm really interested, and Alexia knows this, on, and I hope it's okay I call you Alexia because we're friends. I don't want to be disrespectful of your title and your role. She has a very important role at Treasury, but I'm really obsessed with U.S. leadership and multilaterals. If you follow any of my work, if you have trouble sleeping at night and want to read my stuff, I've written tome after tome and paper after paper on this because my view is the United States has to ride herd on the multilateral system. I know that's like not necessarily the term, but for my people, we need to explain, we need to mind the store on the MDBs. We need to mind the store on them. And so part of the way we do that is through the effective leadership of people like Alexia. So I think they are a force multiplier, in my view, if we're riding herd, to be frank, of a Western form of globalization. And if we're not riding herd, it's a force multiplier of some other form of globalization. And that if you leave a vacuum, somebody else is going to fill that vacuum. And I don't want anyone else filling that vacuum. I wrote a book called The American Imperative. I have a chapter on the multilateral system. I'm sure, Alexia, you read it cover to cover. There'll be a quiz, right? Everybody clear their calendar and read that. But I would just say that I think this is an incredibly important topic, doesn't get enough attention. So I was really appreciative that she said yes. I'm grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding this, supporting the work that we're doing. And so I had a number of things I wanted to talk about with my friend Alexia as it relates to U.S. leadership in the multilateral system. But I would just say, because I think there's a lot on the agenda, a lot of it because of the work that she's doing and the impact that she's having. So, okay, so having said all that, thanks for being here and welcome.
Thank you.
So could we just first start, Alexia, let's just first, how did you get into this business? Can we just start with that? How did you get into this? How did you get into the development business and the MDB business, if I can describe it that way?
No, of course. And Dan, thank you so much for having me. I mean, if there is someone with smarts, with flair, with frank talk, who's a patriot himself, in everything he does every day, including the book, and yes, read it, and yes, I've skimmed it. It's Dan Runde. So he makes our jobs, those of us who are in public service, easier because we can benefit from his ideas, his writing, his thoughts. So I just really also want to thank you, Dan Runde, for your tireless commitment. So, I got this business almost by osmosis, I would say. So my father worked in international development. I grew up for about 10 years in West Africa and then in Austria. He was working for an international organization. So all our dinner table was around why do some people live in countries where they have less opportunities than others, and how do you change that? So I have to admit, I wasn't particularly, creative or rebelled against what my parents did. I sort of really was drawn to it. And I would say, this idea of equality of opportunity is a red thread in my professional career that really matters to me deeply.
So we throw around a lot of technical verbiage. So MDB, Multilateral Development Bank. Could you, for Earth people, so when you go up to the Hill and you explain to Earth people what the hell is the World Bank, so there are probably people at the World Bank on the Hill, these are very smart people. but they don't follow the finer points of MIGA or the IFC or IDB Invest or something called the EBRD. And some of them probably think you can go and get a car loan from these organizations or get a mortgage. Not because they're dumb, it's just because these organizations speak in technocratic gobbledygook and they're not accessible to earth people. So you have to go up to the Hill and explain to staffers who may be just starting as a staffer for an important member of Congress that's overseeing your committee. How do you explain what these organizations are? Like, what is the case for them? I know what this is, and I know the folks in this audience that they showed up here do, but for our folks in television land who may not follow this, you know, what is an MDB and why are these institutions important?
I mean, to be very fair, we need the support of people, including on the Hill, who are working on 1,000 different issues.
100%.
And they have a nanosecond to focus on these issues. So it's not surprising that they don't know the depth of it.
It's not a crack on them. It's to your point, Alexia, that they've got 25,000 other things to deal with. And then the finer points of MEGA or something called a capital increase or the quota reform is like number 250 on the list for them.
But I think, you know, the bottom line, if you go back to the genesis of the creation of these institutions, you know, post World War II, right? So world has fallen apart. Countries have been devastated. You need to rebuild. You need to rebuild countries. You need to rebuild economies. That costs a lot of money. And so what is an effective, efficient way to do that? And these development banks are just that. By pooling capital from countries around the world, right? So it's not just 2 or 3 countries that bear the responsibility, but it's pooling capital from countries around the world, using that capital to then go to capital markets to raise even more money. So that means that taxpayers' money is sort of multiplied over and over again. You have a fantastic, super high value for money financial model to help countries develop. So that's the first message I would give. Secondly, these institutions have learned that it's not just about money, but it's also about what are the right policies, what are the right reforms, what are the right choices that countries make to enable their development. And these institutions, because they work around many countries in a region, or in the case of the World Bank, around the world, have a lot of lessons learned around what works, what doesn't. They pool those lessons learned, and they can feed them back out in the form of support to policymakers around the world, in the form of technical assistance, so that countries have build their own capacities and abilities for the work that they do. So highly leveraged, super great knowledge. And then the last thing I'll say is they are a place that bring people around the table. So not just people's money, but actual human beings around the table. That's the definition of multilateralism. And the value, however difficult it often is, of having people around a table trying to think through what's the best way to think about primary education? What's the best way to think about a response to a horrible pandemic? Having people around the world, around the same table, trying to slog through solutions has values in of itself.
I love it. Okay. Money, knowledge, convening power.
Yes.
And burden sharing. It's a form of collective action and a form of cost sharing and burden sharing, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. They do loans.
Yes.
They can make direct investment in companies.
Yes.
They provide technical assistance and advice. And they do knowledge.
Yes.
Knowledge
and they do
specific.
grants.
And they do some
for the
grants.
poorest country, they do some grants.
IDA, right? Like super duper soft loans.
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So there's the World Bank. There's a series of regional development banks.
Yes.
There's the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the EBRD, which was set up after the fall of the Soviet Union for the kind of, let's call it the post-Soviet space, and now parts of sub-Saharan Africa. There's partially you're doing, but also other
Collective action.
Collective action. Okay. So all right, so there's a series of kind of specific questions one might think about. Maybe we might talk about, I know for the Biden administration, climate has been an important priority. If I said to you, the MDBs, the World Bank Group, and the regional development banks, and I said climate change, how has the Biden administration approached the MDBs, and how should the MDBs be approaching the challenges of climate?
So the Biden administration and the Treasury Department under Secretary Yellen's leadership has been approaching climate and MDBs in a very bullish way.
Yes.
We talked about all the benefits of these development banks. We talked about, the first ones, the World Bank being created right after World War II, EBRD a bit later. The reality is the world has changed since their creation. And so Secretary Yellen went to these development banks and said, given that we've seen, for example, with COVID, extreme poverty increasing for the first time after decades of progress, we've seen, a generation of school children not be educated. We see not just, so that's the sort of pandemic example. With climate change, we see reversal of development gains, whether it's in the agricultural field, for example, but also the increasing fragility and violence that we see around the world that has serious human cost, but also serious strains on fiscal budgets of country because they have to spend more and more on security. So given that these three global challenges, climate change that you were referring to, Dan, but also pandemics and health security and fragility and conflict, are literally not just threatening, but in some cases already reversing development gains, we need the institutions to address that. And so they need to think about their visions, their incentive structures, their operating models, and their financial capacity to help countries respond to these global challenges in a way that permits sustained progress on poverty reduction and sustained progress on inclusive growth. And so that means integrating in the DNA of these institutions, in their country diagnostics, their country strategies, thinking through the positive and negative externalities of all these global challenges. Let me be a bit more simple about this. You're building a road today. If that road is not resistant to extreme heat, if that road is not resistant to extreme water, you're going to have to rebuild it again. So let's spend the dollars wisely and build it smartly at the first time. And that's just a very simple way of just talking about how everything these institutions do need to take into account these global challenges, including climate change, and the banks have stepped up in massive ways.
Okay, so Alexia, there's been a series of international agreements on climate. Some countries, there's this concept called just transitions, where countries who are poor say, look, I didn't contribute to the challenge of climate. I want to build a gas pipeline, or I want to take oil out of the ground. Should MDBs be funding oil or gas projects as part of nationally determined contributions? That's the technical term for these international agreements. How should the MDBs be thinking about oil and gas projects? I just want to be very clear. I'll answer your question, but I want to be very clear. In my view, there is no resilient, long-term, inclusive growth that's not also green. And I think I do not mean one policymaker, one person around the world, one leader around the world doesn't say that. The question is, how do you transition to that? And that's difficult, and that's where the just piece comes through. As you make the difficult, not just energy transition, but whole of economy transition, as you figure out how to unlock the plentiful green jobs that will unlock, because that has to be absolutely front and center of what we do, how do you manage this transition in a way that people don't lose out in real short-term ways? So that, I just wanted to say that. I understand that.
So, the United States, is very clear that we believe that countries need to develop, and including in the energy space, without using fossil fuels. The MDBs have a collective methodology to think about how they design projects in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and in line with countries' own nationally determined contributions. And so we work with the MDBs to look at what are the clean energy alternatives in a way that supports energy access, because that remains a huge challenge in too many parts of the world, and in a way that also promotes energy security, because we've very much seen the risks of reliance on countries, particularly aggressive countries, on energy sources. So all of those three goals are goals that we come together. Clean energy, energy security, and energy access have to come together. We prioritize clean energy choices. We ask for countries in the MDBs to do that. In the instances where there are no credible alternatives, particularly for low-income countries, there are exceptions to our fossil fuel guidance, where we can support, for example, gas if that's needed. So big message is the trajectory of the future is clean energy. We have 3 goals that go together, and for some countries, low-income countries where there is no credible alternative or there's a major national security prioritization, there is a small window, because we're also pragmatic, to consider some other sources of energy.
I want to talk about mining and minerals. I'm trying to get smarter about mining and minerals, and I think if we're going to have a carbon transition for EV batteries and defense and iPhones and all this stuff, we're going to need a bunch of rocks out of the ground and then turning into metals, which is a super dirty thing. I don't believe the American people are going to be cool with the idea that 40, 50, 60, 70% of these funny name metals that I can't spell or pronounce that are super duper important for our future are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
So, and also, this is my view, that I think we're going to have a lot of NIMBY problems in the United States in terms of saying, okay, I was with the governor of Arkansas 2 days ago, and she told me that the third largest deposit of lithium in the world's in Arkansas. And she wants lithium to be what oil has done for Texas. She wants lithium, now maybe this is the wrong place to say that, but anyway, so she wants it to be lithium to be that for Arkansas. Like, you could have knocked me over the feather if you'd said to me, like, lithium, like the third largest resource in the world is Arkansas for lithium. I would have never in a million years thought that. So I don't necessarily want to have a debate about whether or not we're going to solve like the NIMBY problems in the US. My view is I actually think we're going to have a very, very difficult time in the United States in our political process and the way we lawsuits and everything else and permitting reform and whatever. I don't believe it. So we're going to have to go to the global south, and we're going to have a different kind of a partnership. My view is the MDBs are like the WD-40 for that. Like, they're like the accelerant for that, or should be. They should be like, we should be like putting, like, if we were serious about it, we'd have a vice presidency for mining and minerals. Like, I know how these bureaucracies work. You and I both have worked in these things. Like, we should say if you want to, when you grow up, you can become vice president of mining and minerals at the World Bank. And like, that would become a thing. There's not a vice president of mining and minerals. I don't think there's a directorship for mining and minerals right now at the World Bank. It's not a priority bureaucratically. And so I'm sure there's like a sprinkling, there's some, I don't want to say crumbs or pebbles. There's some pebbles of work across the system, but it's not a big initiative. So I want to talk about if we want to have a carbon transition, you tell me, 3 times, 4 times, 40 times the amount of cobalt given the current technology constraints. It ain't going to be here, and we ain't, when the smoke clears, when the American people figure out that they're switching their dependence from a variety of countries on oil to the People's Republic of China, there's going to be a collective freak out. So how do you see the MDBs given the picture I've just painted on mining and minerals?
I think this is a critical question. I think we all have to get both smarter about mining and more comfortable about mining, and particularly what does smart mining and responsible mining look like. And I think, from what you were saying, I think you were alluding to the fact that the MDBs retrenched a bit away from mining.
They break out into cooties, I think is the technical term. Like, when I was in second grade, that's what we said. Like, they'd rather get 6 root canals than work on mining and minerals. I think that's the technical term.
And to be fair to them, it was partly also because of shareholders, right? Because there are a lot of risks. There are environmental risks, there are social risks, and so there was a retrenchment. And I think the message now from a shareholder like the United States is we've got to look at mining again. And for the reasons that you just mentioned, without nickel, without cobalt, without lithium, we're just not going to have the energy transition that we need. And so our job is not to move away from complexity, it's to dive into complexity and figure out how to support countries with responsible mining. And by the way, it also happens to be sort of a beautiful thing where a lot of emerging markets, a lot of developing countries happen to have those resources. That's in perfect alignment with what the global economy needs. So it could be a real win-win for them at a time where they're struggling a lot. Okay, then the question becomes, what do you do? And I think you need to remember that mining is not just about getting the stuff out of the ground. First of all, it's about having the right policy regimes in place around mining, land issues. How do you spend the revenues for mining so that actually it is shared and enjoyed by a majority of people in that said country, 100%. Not just a few. So all these issues of governance around this is really important. Then I think countries are saying, this time around, we don't just want to be exporting raw materials, we want to extract more value, i.e. we want to see, refinement in our countries as well. You alluded to this as well in your brilliant opening on this particular question. A lot of that processing is dirty. The technologies, even in the United States, dirty, very energy intensive in some cases. And so there's a lot of research and development and R&D that's needed in terms of finding the most energy efficient, clean ways to do the processing. So that's a big area of work as well. Environmental, labor standards. Under the Japanese G7 presidency, they came up with this idea of, let me see if I can get this right, resilient and inclusive supply chain enhancement, RISE.
That is amazing.
The RISE proposal, which actually says, let's not only talk about the financing, important as that is, but let's do that work around thinking about how some of these countries can enter into global supply chains. Let's look at what work is needed upstream. That means policy work, as well as midstream, so that countries can engage in this. And I just want to point out the IDB for 1 second, if I may, because I see the former executive vice president of the IDB here.
And he's come back. He's made a return.
I actually met her.
Oh, yes, that's right.
You're right. We have several IDB colleagues here.
Yeah.
They are working right now with countries that are part of the Americas Prosperity Partnership and doing competitiveness analysis on several supply chains, including critical minerals, to figure out what countries can really be competitive in this space. So doing that sort of economic analysis work.
So could we just do a parenthetical? I want to come to some other sectoral things, but let's just talk about the IDB for a second. There's IDB Invest. Tell us about what is IDB Invest, and tell us about what the Biden administration is supporting vis-a-vis IDB Invest.
One of my favorite topics recently, so again, great to have IDB colleagues here. So in March, the IDB group had its annual meetings, and it made some really important decisions, notably around its private sector arm the part of the IDB group that works with the private sector. It's called the IDB Invest. And the shareholders of the institution approved a new business model for that institution, as well as a $3.5 billion capital increase. The new business model is super powerful because at its base, it says, the way I'm going to have a lot of impact in countries is not just by deploying my $3.5 billion, but it's using my dollars and my skill set to take on hard projects, or originate them, develop them. When they get to a point where the return on investment might actually be attractive to the private sector, rather than saying, I've done all this hard work, I'm going to hold on tight to that, I'm actually going to share that asset, share that investment with the private sector, bring them in earlier. And so the MDB is doing exactly its role of taking the risk where it's highest, identifying projects, structuring it, and then inviting the private sector to come in. This is called an originate to share model. And doing this not only on a transaction by transaction basis, which is tiny for the private sector, they like scale, but sort of trying to find pooled approaches to having, a bunch of assets together to offer to the private sector. With the new capital, it also means that IDB Invest will be able to take more risk, including in smaller economies in the Caribbean that desperately need private sector development as well. It'll be able to do more equity, which is a really high impact instrument as well. So we expect to see about $102 billion in new lending from IDB Invest over the next 10 years. And what's important is we not only discussed IDB Invest in March, we also talked about the public side of the house, because to have a strong private sector, you need a strong enabling public sector. And so there were a bunch of reforms that we also adopted as shareholders around the new strategy for the public side of the house to make sure that the investment climates in countries are such that the private sector interest will come. Last word, we also looked at IDB Labs, which is the entrepreneurial part of IDB Invest, that ecosystem that works with startups and really does the bottom-up building of the private sector. So you really had a holistic, strong IDB group coming out of the March annual meetings.
So are you going to, as the Biden administration has made a request to the Congress to support this capital increase for IDB Invest, is that right?
Absolutely. The authorization and appropriation request for this capital increase is in the fiscal 25 budget.
Okay. And the argument would be, if the Congress supports this and makes a small contribution, they'll leverage multiples of that money. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
All in the goal of impact, citizen security,
and jobs in the region.
Infrastructure, All the good stuff.
All the good stuff. Okay. Love it. Thank you very much. Okay. I want to talk about the digital divide.
Yes.
So I think the MDBs are a really important financier, knowledge partner, policy partner, convener, problem solver as it relates to the digital divide. We all sat in our basements for a year during COVID all over the world. And there was an acceleration of the digital transformation. It wasn't just in Bethesda or Silver Spring, it was all over the world in the global south. So one way or the other, the digital divide is going to be closed. My personal preference is not via the unholy trinity of Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay. So we have to enable an alternative. So the financier of that, one of the major financiers of that is the World Bank, the private sector arms of the MDBs like the IFC, and the various alphabet soups of regional development banks that I've listed earlier. So tell me in your mind, how do you all think about closing the digital divide, and what kind of progress are you seeing the MDBs making on supporting the closing of the digital divide?
I mean, first of all, I want to agree with you wholeheartedly about how important that is. So those of us who were sitting in Silver Spring or Bethesda, 90% of people in high-income countries had access to the internet. 2.3 billion people around the world do not have connectivity. Okay, so, and by the way, we learned in the United States, even some people did not have connectivity, but obviously those are much smaller numbers. So we still have a really long way to go. And I think the MDBs have a really powerful role there. And at the request and insistence of countries, all the MDBs are stepping up to identify digitalization as a major goal. For example, the World Bank identified accelerating digitalization, I don't do well with that word, is as one of 6 global practice programs that they've launched. So what are these global practice programs? The idea is on very critical issues like digitalization. It's really about combining all parts of the MDB, the private, the public, to have integrated solutions at scale with greater speed to be actually able to make progress on these issues. And they've identified priority for this work. Number one, the basics, right? So increasing broadband access as being really critical, but also something we don't always speak about, digital skills, building up the actual digital skills so that the entire population can benefit from the changing nature of economies that are so full based on digital. And then the third piece is around building the digital infrastructure, and that's to your point about who are the vendors. And by the way, the Treasury Department screens any project where there is technology to look out for what we call untrusted vendors, so that we take that sort of responsibility very seriously. But the building out the public infrastructure. So that's sort of the three pieces. Includes things like
digital public goods,
exactly.
Identity, digital identity, and digital financial inclusion, because that's coming.
Absolutely.
That's part of the conversation.
And EBRD, just to give one more example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is working on its new strategy, and they're thinking that private capital mobilization will be a cross-cutting goal, and then the second cross-cutting goal would be digitalization, because it enables every sector of the economy when done well.
Okay, so Alexia, I want to talk about women's empowerment, which is a big topic, but the MDBs do a lot of things to support financial inclusion and other ways of supporting women. Talk a little bit about that and what you've seen in your time, your time in Treasury.
So when I was at the World Bank, I focused specifically on financial inclusion. So I've worked in the space for over a decade as a personal passion of mine. Yeah, I was at CGAP.
CGAP's like the Major League Baseball Commission of microfinance. More than that, but
we've got Major League Commissions, we've got W40. I mean, we've got lots of analogies here.
Try and keep it simple.
I love it.
Try and keep it simple, right?
I love it. And it's sometimes shocking to me. You can look at how much progress we've made, but it's sometimes shocking to me, I have to say, still, how much of a road we have to still go on these issues, even though the evidence, including randomized controlled trials, so the sort of highest level of evidence, shows just how powerful it is when a woman has access to financial services, the kinds of investments that are made in the family, in education, in nutrition, not to mention the innovation and creativity that's unleashed in terms of women running their own businesses. So the evidence is striking on this, and yet there are challenges in many countries. Sometimes there are legal challenges. There are legal challenges around, for example, land ownership or inheritance, which makes it more difficult for women, where collateral is still asked to have a collateral to get access to financial services. There are impediments with respect to girls, young girls, in terms of savings, because again, the data is very clear. If you start financial services through savings at a young age, that puts you on a trajectory of financial health that's much better. But in some places, you still can't open an account. There's safe space and time.
If you're a woman.
If you're a woman.
That's crazy.
There's still safe space and time issues, right? So if you cannot, if your movement is limited in a certain country, think Afghanistan, and you can't make it to a brick and mortar bank, how do you have access to banking services, in the privacy of your home on your cell phone? So these are huge issues. It starts with financial identity, the IDPs that you're mentioning, the infrastructure, so needing not a greater diversity of financial institutions, including non-bank financial institutions, credit unions, digital, the payout point. So if you're not going to a bank, you need to be able to go to little shops to get cash when you do still need cash at times. And then financial literacy, which is really making sure that you're able to interact with financial services in a very smart way, that you understand the fees that are there, that you understand the opportunities of compounded interest rates if you're trying to save. So huge agenda. There's the women's WIFI. Women's entrepreneurial. Help me out, someone here. WIFI is the acronym. Anyway, it stands for Women's.
Come on, Romina, I'm looking at you.
And Finance Initiative.
Bail us out here.
And Finance Initiative, maybe. Anyway, it's a really cool. It's too many acronyms, but it's a really cool trust fund that actually tries to focus on high growth potential entrepreneurs, because there's a lot of money for sort of the micro space now, but the high growth potential entrepreneurial segment is harder and focuses on women-owned, women-led high growth entrepreneurial strategy. So that's really exciting, and all the MDBs can implement and get funding from Wi-Fi to accelerate those goals.
I love it. Okay, great. All right, I want to talk about a couple other things that are on my mind. So I'd say I worked at the IFC 07 to 2010. It's a different world than, say, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And so China is now, I think, the largest financier, is a bigger financier, I think, than the bank. And don't quote me exactly on the statistics, but they're a much bigger player in debt than they were 20 years ago. There's this thing called Belt and Road. There's this thing called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. There's this thing called the New Development Bank, or whatever the heck it's called these days. I forget. Is that what it's called these days?
That's correct.
Yeah. Anyways, I don't like it. Whatever it's called, I don't like it. But I'd say there's a series of, and I think Belt and Road is a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of China's friends and potential friends. So it's a great idea. It's just the only problem with it is it's their idea. So we're going to need to figure out what our positive, forward-looking agenda is that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of America's friends and potential friends in the global South. But anyways, all that said, they're a much bigger player in the global South than they were 20 years ago. They're now the largest trading partner for 120 or so countries. They're often the largest debt holder for a lot of these countries, and they're often one of the largest infrastructure players or digital infrastructure players in a lot of these countries. That's different than 20 or 25 years ago. Okay, having said all that, there's a couple of things. The first is, I think the House of Representatives last year voted unanimously to ask the Biden administration, or to ask the multilateral system, because it's a little bit vague how you do this, and there are probably some people in the audience that can tell me how you do this, but there's some committee or group of organizations that sit in secret session to figure who's a developing country and who's not. I think UNCTAD is one of them, and some other organizations. So they voted unanimously to say that China should not be a developing country anymore. What is the Biden administration or the Treasury Department's reaction to the idea of the People's Republic of China being a developing country?
Secretary Yellen has been unequivocal, including in on numerous occasions while testifying on the Hill. We do not believe that China should be borrowing from the multilateral development system. We do not believe that China should be borrowing from the international system. Very clear We carry that posture into the boardrooms of the development banks.
Yeah.
I was at the Asian Development Bank annual meeting in Tbilisi, Georgia, carried that message yet again.
Yeah.
One of our policy goals is to see a downward trajectory of China borrowing from the development banks to zero.
Is there a downward trajectory?
There is a downward trajectory in both the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. I think China borrowing from the IBRD, for example, is now about 3.6% of overall borrowing. So it's on a downward trajectory. The slope needs to be steeper, and it needs to get to zero. That's very clear, and we want to see China contributing to global development priorities.
Pay more condo fees.
For sure.
Pay more condo fees. Okay, so great. I love it. That was great. I mean, we could end the conversation right now. That's all I wanted to know. This is great. No, I have several things I want to talk more about. That wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, so the more thorny issue, and it's not there's not a elegant answer to this problem, but okay, so 25 years ago, there was a movement, some of it by religious people, some of it development advocacy people, and it was a simpler time. There was a lot of multilateral debt, and there was some big money center banks. In the 80s, you could get Paul Volcker and a bunch of guys in a room with cigars, and you could still smoke cigars probably at the time to do this, and you'd work it out at the spring meetings of the IMF and the IMF conference room. You could probably smoke cigars in the conference room at the time. And you just 6 or 8 people would get in a room and solve this. Now the world is there's debt a lot of it's from China in various flavors. The terms of the debt are super murky. Like, is it a 10-year loan or a 20-year loan? Is there collateral? Like, if you don't pay the debt on the loan, do I get control of the port? What's the interest rate? Was there a bribe paid or not? As part of that, we don't know. And so there's a lot of murkiness and there have been efforts to try and get everybody, including China, to put their cards on the table in terms of saying, here's all my debt, here's my China Development Bank debt, here's my China Exim Bank debt, here's the, et cetera, et cetera. So it's super duper more complicated. So we went through this exercise 25 years ago. We went at a moment of the Clinton administration, a Republican-controlled Congress said, we will forgive debt and we will lead a process to forgive debt in many developing countries. There was many benefits to that. I think there was an African renaissance in a number of countries, partially because of this. This was a good thing, and it was the right thing to do. We're now in a situation where a number of developing countries are now having heavy debt burden, some of it controlled by hedge funds, and it's like a lot of them. It's not 8, it's like 8,000 of them or 800 of them. And then you've got a big lender in China where if you say, write off $100 of loan, it has an impact on their books back home, but also they have a big debt crisis domestically. So if they take a 20% reduction on the $100 in Zambia, some debt holder in, Shanghai is going to say, why the hell did they get a 20% write-off on their debt? Why can't we get a 20% write-off on their debt? And so they has domestic implications for China. So as a result, they've been kind of not putting their cards on the table, and they've been, to put it mildly, heavily resistant to various forms of collective action. There's all these words. There's this G20 this, and the IMF that, and put your cards on the table this, and the Paris Club plus that, et cetera. So what the hell do we do about this really complicated debt crisis where China's heavily involved in it? There's a bunch of hedge funds, and there's a big collective action problem, and it's harder to solve this, and some of the solutions may be less happy and pleasant because of the fact that that China is a major debt holder and is involved in this.
Okay, this is a really fundamental issue. The number of countries that have significant debt vulnerabilities is, I think, one of the top challenges of our times right now. And I just want to remind ourselves in a very basic way why this is important. When countries have super high debt servicing burdens, they are literally taking money away from investments in education,
schools and health
to make those payments. And our Undersecretary at Treasury, Jay Shamba, gave a speech right before spring meetings where he talked about the fact that there's about 50 low-income and middle-income countries that actually have negative flows leaving their country. So they're getting more money is going back out.
So they're paying more in interest
than they're getting from foreign aid dollars. Yeah.
So they're paying more on interest to these debt holders than all the collective foreign aid dollars that are coming in the door. They're paying more on debt than on education. They're paying more on debt than on health in some cases. Is that true?
So that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
So what do? I think there's 3 prongs of work that we need to focus on. The first one, which is back to basics, is avoiding countries from having a problem in the first place.
Amen.
What does that mean? It means really investing in good debt management practices, good public financial management. The World Bank in 2020 or 2021 released its new Sustainable Development Finance policy that focuses on a couple of things. Number one, making sure that countries set policy goals around public financial and debt management. Number two, making sure that there's increased and better coordination across all creditors and the country so that there's actually this is a transparency point, so there's a real understanding of what's going on. And then thirdly, continuing to push, again, on the transparency point, which is really fundamental. And the MDBs have a really strong role to play in coordination with the IMF in helping build those capacities in countries. It means that countries need to be able to think every time they borrow, because you need to borrow. I borrowed to get my home. Borrowing is not a bad word. Debt is not a bad word.
Debt isn't a bad thing.
But you need to look at your portfolio of what you're borrowing for. You need to make sure that there's returns coming from your borrowings as well. And so how do you, even from in the infrastructure space, how do you think about your infrastructure needs, and how do you organize in your infrastructure master plan a balance of projects with a balance of financing sources so that it all evens out and puts you in a good place. So that is not what people talk about in most conferences because it feels technical and not exciting and not political, but that is the foundational piece, and so I want to insist on that.
Thank you.
Secondly, countries, even that do the right thing, sometimes get close to being in trouble. Why? The interest rate environment has changed completely. So they had, borrowed at super at certain rates.
Interest rates that float, that rise and fall with the interest rates.
Even if they're doing the right things, they're in trouble. So how do we, the international system, catch them from falling over the cliff? And so that was Jay Shambaugh's speech, was how can bilateral creditors, the international financial institutions, the private sector step up for the countries that are doing the right things but are about to fall off the cliff with a surge of the right type of financing so we keep them afloat. So countries that have a liquidity problem but not a sovereign, solvency problem, thank you, that have a liquidity problem but not a solvency problem. So that, I think, also deserves much more attention. And then the third piece is what has gotten all the attention, which is countries that have already are in trouble, in major trouble. And that's the work that we're doing around the G20 common framework to have a predictable and timely process for debt restructuring for countries. The MDBs have a huge role here because they're the ones who often come in and inject fresh, super concessional financing to keep the countries afloat. The reality is that the debt restructurings have taken too much time. We need all countries, all G20 countries, all countries to step up to the plate and play their responsibility. We need the private sector to do the same so that we're able to get countries through their debt restructuring in a much better way. We've made some progress, but clearly that remains high on the agenda.
It's easy to sit in a think tank and say, well, we just need to solve this. But as I said earlier, 30 or 40 years ago, this was a much easier problem to solve because you had 4, 10, 20 stakeholders. Now you got 400 or 800 stakeholders, and not all of them are on the same page. So the level of herding cats is a hell of a lot more complicated. Yeah. So it's like I said, it's easy to sit in a comfortable think tank like mine and say, oh, we can just, come up with some elegant solution. It's not so easy. So this is a very hard task. So, okay, thank you, Alexia, for that. I want to come to one other thing that I think is really important. The EBRD, which is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, really, really well. You served there with great distinction as a senior civil servant there, as a corporate officer, I think. And so it's the bank of it's sort of a private sector-led bank for the post-Soviet space, plus now the sub-Saharan Africa. It's starting to get into there. It has a big role in Ukraine. So could you please talk about what is the EBRD doing in Ukraine? Could you also please talk about what the Biden administration did, which I thought was excellent, early on in the war to support the EBRD, because I thought it was particularly important, and I know you'll be modest about this, but I suspect you probably had something to do with what you're going to describe, and I think it was really important that the Biden administration did that.
So EBRD is quite a unique institution across the development system, indeed created at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so the focus is transition to market economies, right? Because these were centrally planned economies, transition to market economies, and frankly also very much in countries that are committed to democracy. And so very effective in the former Soviet bloc, but also I want to say after the Arab Spring, I just wanted to add that to the conversation, after the Arab Spring went into many countries in North Africa and the Middle East. So a major player, for example, in Egypt, also expanded into Mongolia and to Turkey. And then now, as you just mentioned, there are 6 countries that they're looking to start, that are joining the EBRD. I think Benin was the first sub-Saharan African country to become an official member of the EBRD, and eventually they'll get country of operation status. Now, EBRD was a first mover with conviction and determination and creativity in Ukraine. They had
one of the biggest investors.
They had over 100 people, living in the country, so knew the country inside out, and were determined to have a role. And so very early on identified a couple of key areas. One was supporting vital infrastructure. So for example, making sure that the lights were kept on, that in the winter there was heating. That was a really important piece. Another one, as Ukraine is one of the breadbaskets of this world, and so support to the agribusiness sector, support to trade facilitation, a lot of trade facilitation work done in the early days. Now, that was really risky, right? It was a country at war. And so it determined that we have the skills, the knowledge to do work there, but we need to be able to have the risk coverage from our shareholders. And so initially they wanted a 1-to-1 rich coverage for their work. Once they got into the country and started seeing what they could do, they reduced that to a 50% coverage. The United States, at record speed, and I'm so grateful for all parts of the system, including the Congress, was able to give the EBRD $500 million that provided that donor risk coverage, and also incited other countries to also provide donor financing. And so that meant that the EBRD was able to come in really quickly and build its volume of support in the country. And the last thing I'll say is, part of the strategy here, in addition to the vital infrastructure, and the trade facilitation and the work on agribusiness, is even though there's a war in Ukraine, as you see from the news, economic activity is continuing, and what we call the real economy is continuing, and the private sector needs to be supported. The more you preserve that, when peace come, and peace will come, the less you have to build from a lower base. And so the idea is to preserve, as much of an economic life as you can. And so that's why investment in the private sector in Ukraine, knowing there's going to be a ton of public investments that need to be made, but continuing to support the private sector through the war and after is so fundamental. And the EBRD,
It's been such an important partner.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ukraine grew at 5% last year.
Yeah.
And which I think was the highest growth rate in Europe. Yeah. So it's been, everything you say I 100% agree with. Okay, let me ask you one last question about Ukraine, which is maybe a little tricky. So I would prefer that the United States provide grant support for Ukraine. And I think there's been discussion in the Congress about, so I did an op-ed, but if push comes to shove, I want assistance to go to Ukraine. So I'm of the view that for some kinds of economic assistance, I would be okay with providing loans to Ukraine. So I wrote an op-ed in Newsmax, knowing my audience, okay, I wasn't going to write this in CNN, but I was going to get that saying, we don't need a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, we need a lend-lease for Ukraine. FDR, when he didn't have the political support to support the UK at the time, lent stuff to the UK. And I mentioned in the op-ed that the year that the British paid back their Lend-Lease loans was 2006. So that loan was in 1939, and then they paid it back in 2006, whatever that is. And I'm not going to do the math with my fingers and toes here, but it's like more than 70 years or something. So I don't know if we lent money to Ukraine on a 70-year timeline, like IDA loans are what, 40 years? So let's say like super duper IDA terms, so 70-year timelines, 10-year grace period. I don't know what the interest rate is for Haiti these days. Is it 0.5%? So, okay, we won't compare it, but let's say it's 0.5%. So let's say the interest rate was 0.5%, 10-year grace period, and a 70-year term for paying it back. Couldn't we live with some of this being, I'm not saying I want to do this. I'd prefer, like I said, grants. I'd prefer other vehicles. And I'm sure there's not an official position for the Treasury on this, but what's your reaction to the idea if we had to provide some loans to Ukraine? What would you say to that?
I'm going to be very brief here and say the following. I'm deeply grateful that the SUP went through. That was vital.
Amen. Yes.
Vital. The U.S. has been an absolute leader in our support to Ukraine from day one. I think our quick and fast support for Ukraine really helped to rally the Europeans. I'm really glad we came through with the SUP. We need military assistance for Ukraine. We need direct budget support for Ukraine.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. We've been very active here at CSIS supporting the SUP. We took the first real congressional delegation to Ukraine 2 weeks before the SUP. 3 Republican members of Congress. That's great. 3 Democratic. All the credit goes to my colleague Elizabeth Hoffman, who's a genius, who's an organizational genius, an extremely hard worker. It was her idea. We took a staff del. We took the first real staff del. It was her idea. I was happy to be her wingman on both of these. We took 8 staffers for the first real CODEL to Ukraine. I'd like to see the rule, this isn't your bailiwick, but I'd like to make it easier for members of Congress and staffers to visit Ukraine. This is a different department, so it's not you, Alexia. So we did 4 days on the ground in Ukraine for staffers. My colleague went to 80 Republican House offices to ask. 4 said yes. 2 flaked. And we had a Senator Joni Ernst. So we had 3 Republicans. Getting Democrats, that wasn't a problem. They were like going to pay us to go. That wasn't the problem. We wanted Republicans. So we were able to get Republican staffers, and we've done a lot with our Ukraine Economic Reconstruction Commission. We're going to do a reconstruction conference in September. We'd love to have senior Treasury participation in that, and so I'll come back to you about that at another time. So we're all in that. I understand your point on what you've said about Ukraine. Okay, so I have a couple questions from the audience. I want to give a chance to some very smart people who are here. So my friend Rich Bissell, who's a senior advisor here at CSIS, has a couple questions. And he was at the World Bank, he was at AID. So what is the state of play in the IDA replenishment, and what is the U.S. target for the IDA replenishment? IDA, for Earth people, is the soft loan window for the World Bank, right? So.
Thanks for that. IDA is a huge priority this year. That's the part that provides grants and low-cost, highly concessional loans to the poorest countries in the world. We're very proud that the U.S., along with other donors, accelerated. So because it's cheap money, it has to be replenished, meaning you have to give more money to it regularly on a 3-year cycle. With COVID, the U.S., with other donors, actually accelerated the last replenishment of IDA, and it was a historic replenishment. The world has not recovered, evenly, beautifully everywhere, and so the demands on IDA continue to be huge, and there's a demand for IDA to be larger than $100 billion. President Ruto convened African leaders in Nairobi 2 weeks ago on that case. The replenishment, which is the negotiations that happen to figure out the money, are still happening. The pledging is for December. So right now the U.S. Would say 2 things on financing. Yes, it needs to be robust, including from all sources. So actually when I was in government last time, we had an innovation for IDA where it went to the market for the first time. So it was able to use its track record to go to the market, and that made it really big. So we want to see if there's more that can be done to responsibly stretch the balance sheet of IDA, so that can be a source of increased growth for this IDA replenishment, as well as all the donors really doing their best, and the U.S. will do our best. We don't have a target number for our replenishment at this stage. We're focusing also on the policy package, because there's a financing package and there's a policy package. And IDA, at the end of the day, It's about impact. You need money to have impact, but impact needs to be the North Star. And so we really want IDA to focus, for example, on doing even more around debt management practices. We were just talking about that, and helping countries think through their sustainable financing plan. So that's a priority for us. We want IDA to do more to help countries be prepared to tackle these global challenges that I mentioned: climate, pandemics, and fragility, and violence and conflict. That's a second major objective. And then we want the financial model for IDA to be sustainable. So we want to leverage the balance sheet, but in a way that is cognizant of the fact that we still want to make sure there's enough concessionality in IDA that it meets the needs of countries that need, pure grants, for example, or very, very cheap financing, because the money that's raised on the market is a little bit more expensive. So we want to think about a big IDA today, but also an IDA that's there in the future. So balancing short and long-term goals. But I think the US has an incredible bipartisan strong track record for being a strong partner of IDA, and I imagine that will continue.
Yeah, I hope so too. Okay, so this is from a former U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, Bob Blake. You have been such a great leader of the JETP process, so you have to explain to Earth people. I don't know what the heck JETP is, so please explain what that is. With Indonesia, could you give us how the JET process is progressing?
So Ambassador Blake has been such an important part of these just energy transition partnerships. That's a really, I think, exciting model of how to help countries with their energy transitions. It started initially with South Africa, and then Indonesia was the second country. Essentially, it's the idea of aligning to support government big ambition, so governments that are willing to have huge ambitions in terms of their energy transition, their and targets around power sector getting to net zero, for example, aligning public sector financing. So there's about now 9 countries that have made commitments to the Indonesian JETPs, and this was an innovation in Indonesia, also the private sector. So when the Just Energy Transition Partnership was announced for Indonesia, there was a $10 billion commitment from the official sector side and a $10 billion commitment from banks that are a member of the GFANZ Alliance. So, and then there's a policy piece, alignment around the policy. So that's the model. We now have at COP last year, Indonesia released its comprehensive investment and policy plan, which basically has the policy commitments that they need to make, the list of projects that they think need to be developed to manage their energy transition, which includes projects in the renewable space, projects in coal decommissioning, because they are very reliant on coal, and projects around dieselization. It's difficult work because this affects all aspects of the economy. Indonesia is a country that has a lot of nickel. And so the electricity demand in Indonesia has grown since we negotiated the agreement, and they're saying we're not going to stop our growth because we made we have a commitment around the JETPs, and so we discovered a lot more what we call captive coal in the system, which means industry developing their own energy sources from coal, which we did not know about with the negotiation, and so the country is now sort of working with the International Energy Association to sort of really understand how much captive coal they have. And we're working on policy changes. We have identified priority projects for 2024 that we hope will come to financial close, which includes a coal decommissioning project with the Asian Development Bank, Cirebon. It includes some wind and solar, and it includes one digitalization project. There's still some tricky policy issues that we're working on, including around local content requirements, but that's part of life. It's an election year, so a new government has been elected.
In Indonesia.
Yeah, a new government has been elected. Thank you.
Yeah.
A new government has been elected. We're waiting for the new one to take power, but we understand that they will continue to support the goals of this project. I think the last thing I'll say on this is these are major whole of society, whole of government, whole of economy changes. They're difficult. So if people want quick wins, leave. If you have resolve and determination and the ability to keep your North Star about what you're trying to do with the government as a good government partner, iterate as new information comes through, adapt, agility, keep focused on the big goal, we can move mountains. And I think the Indonesian JETP will prove to be successful. Every day is not successful. Every day is not easy. But I think it will accelerate Indonesia's own and I want to underline and bold this, Indonesia's own energy and climate and development ambitions will.
Great. Please join me in thanking Alexia Latortue. Thank you, Alexia.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Can I?